I lost $317,000. My life savings. I felt like I was a pretty good judge of character. And in my head, I was thinking things like, yeah, but that would never happen to me. The person that lost money to scams or fraud, particularly romance fraud, were often sort of presented as uneducated, middle aged women sitting in their lounge room, looking for love on the internet, lonely, vulnerable. And it wasn't until he was arrested and I saw a Crime Stoppers video that's when I realized what had happened.
Some decisions look great on paper. Others make people blink twice and ask if you're okay. And it's usually the second kind that changes everything. This is Unpopular Decisions, where we're talking about what it really takes to choose yourself when it feels like disappointing others. Hit subscribe so you don't miss a single conversation. I'm your host, Jamila Calhoun. Many of us are taught to trust our instincts, especially in relationships. But what happens when the person you trusted most isn't actually who they said they were? I'm joined by Tracy Hall, an author, speaker, and former tech marketing executive who lost over $300,000 to a man she was in a relationship with. He was later revealed to be one of Australia's most notorious con men. But this story isn't about money. It's about trust, identity, and what it takes to rebuild your life after betrayal. In this episode, we talk about the hidden psychology of fraud, the shame that keeps people silent, and what it actually takes to trust yourself again after everything falls apart. Let's get into it. Tracy, thanks so much for being on the show. I'm so excited to hear more about your story, and I know our audience will enjoy it as well. But before we get into everything, can you tell us your unpopular decision?
Yes. Hi, my name is Tracy Hall. And my unpopular decision is that I chose to speak publicly about being defrauded out of my life savings.
Everyone is probably their worst nightmare is being caught in that situation. And also, in some sense, a lot of us may go through life with the illusion that it would never happen to us,
Yeah.
right?
I was one of those people.
Yeah, I mean, it's natural to kind of have that feeling. And I feel like a lot of people, even if it has happened to them, they don't speak up about it. And so that also means for a lot of us, we don't really encounter people that we know have been through that situation. So it kind of feels very removed. Before all of this happened in your life, what version of life were you kind of trying to live? What was meaningful to you? If your career was important, what were you really kind of driven by?
Before this happened, I had just turned 40, so I guess I was in that season of my life, my next decade. Yeah, so my career was really important to me, and I was working a pretty big role at eBay in Sydney, Australia. I was looking after a brand and marketing communications team, and I was just getting my head around this new life that I found myself in, parenting, single parenting a 5-year-old, and having a career and trying to do it all. I was very stretched. I had majority care of my child, so I was pretty stretched. I was working long hours. And then, on the other side of things, I was trying to work out who I was as a person, not as a wife, forging this new decade that I found myself in and what I wanted my life to be. So that was really where I was at. I was optimistic about the future. I was comfortable with the decisions that had been made. And I was working on building my career to be financially independent and all the other things. So yeah, it felt like a good time of my life. I felt strong. I felt thoughtful about my future, and I was really clear about what I wanted.
Well, it also sounds like there was a big part of your kind of healing and rebuilding your life that also felt like I'm really grateful that I've been able to make good decisions
Yeah.
throughout my life that has set me up in a way that I'm able to provide for my child, have this career that is, very successful. When you thought about the idea of people who had been a victim of romantic fraud or scammed in general, what were your feelings about people who ended up in that situation back then?
To be honest, I didn't really think about it. It wasn't something that had ever touched my life. And if if I have to think about stories that I'd heard, there weren't many, to be honest. And the ones that I did hear and the narrative that was attached to the stories that I did hear were of, the person that lost money to scams or fraud, particularly romance fraud, were often sort of presented as uneducated, middle-aged women sitting in their lounge room, looking for love on the internet, lonely, vulnerable, and they're looking for their knight in shining armor to come and, rescue them. That it was this kind of trope that was in the media and the narrative at the time. And to be fair, I think that narrative still exists to a point, which is why I do what I do now. But that's what was presented to me, and that's what I guess created this feeling inside myself where I didn't think about it because I didn't look or sound like these women. That wasn't my life. I had a very successful career. I had traveled the world. I have had a stellar education. I have a great family. My friends are incredible. I felt like I was a pretty good judge of character. And in my head, I was thinking things like, yeah, but that would never happen to me. That would never be me. I
Mhm.
would never find myself in that situation. Even things like, how could you be so stupid? As if you'd believe that.
Mm.
So they were probably the things that I thought just based on media narrative and the stories that I'd heard before. But certainly I had never seen a story about somebody who looked or sounded like me in that position. So I couldn't relate. So I just distanced myself from it and thought, yeah, well, that would never happen to me.
Yeah, it's such an important thing for us to have humility about. And I'm sure that's a lot of what your work is about now, educating people about this type of fraud. A lot of us feel kind of completely inoculated against this. Like we are smart, we have, good discernment, we make good decisions in our careers, in our lives. But there's quite a bit of psychological elements around how fraud manifests, especially today. It's more complex than it used to be. This idea of just somebody, sending you an email.
With loads of spelling
But
mistakes
you
and grammatical errors.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe touch on your story now and what you did go through. If you could tell us about maybe your first meeting with this individual, what were you excited about in this relationship and what maybe made you trust him initially?
Yeah, well, it took a long time for us to meet, to be honest. So I met a man by the name of Max Tavita on a dating app. He presented himself as a 41-year-old chief investment officer for a family office. We just sort of got to know each other slowly over the functionality of the app, I guess texting, and we had a few phone calls. Like I said, I was really stretched at the time. I didn't have a lot of time, and single moms, particularly, will understand that you actually have very little time to interject something new into your life. It was a very slow beginning, to be honest. I guess what I was excited about was this was a person that I feel like I could communicate with. He was really great at communicating. The conversations we had had both on the phone and on the app and through text were, really thoughtful, but there was also some really great banter. Like he had a really great sense of humor. We grew up in the same kind of era in Australia in, the beach culture and things like this. So we had a lot of very similar references in terms of our humor and our reflections and how we'd grown up. And so that was great. And he was really athletic, he was sporty. We had very similar interests. So everything kind of aligned, I guess, in that way. And so I was excited to meet him because we had gotten along so well. Our first date was really simple. Like he picked me up in the city after a work day. My daughter was staying with her dad that night, and we went for a meal. He booked the restaurant. He did everything, which was great. We just had this really beautiful meal. He didn't really drink much, and that was really nice. He drove, and yeah, it was just a great conversation, a lot of laughs, and it got to, I don't know what time it was, not very late, and I yawned. I did a really big yawn in the middle of dinner, which is often not a great sign, but I was just so exhausted from
I
work.
love that.
I was working a really big project and I was so embarrassed about yawning. And he said, "You must be exhausted. Let me get you home." And there was no fuss, there was no anything. And he said, "Let me put you in a cab and you need to go home and you need to sleep." I don't know, everything about it just felt really easy, really natural, really relaxed, really fun and funny. And then when the time came and he could see that I was tired, he didn't make a fuss. He just said, "Let me get you home. Let me look after you." That's how it felt. And that was our first date. He didn't need a pat on back for that, but just the fact he noticed that was great. And then that's where it began. And then it continued from there. And I guess it was just a slow, uh, I called it a slow burn. We didn't see each other that often, every sort of maybe every 10 days, every week, every 2 weeks, whatever my schedule allowed. He was so comfortable with that. And quite a lot of times we hear these things, you get love bombed. It's a red flag if you're love bombed. If someone's really on you and really wants all these things quickly. He wasn't like that. He was very happy to be patient and wait. That felt really good to me. I didn't feel pressured. Whatever I could fit in, he was happy with, and our relationship went from there.
Yeah, well, it's also really tough just thinking about how often we don't get those kind of basic aspects of consideration and care
Yeah, the
in
bar's not
dating
very
these
high, is
days.
it?
So exactly. So this, I could completely relate with the fact, like, oh my God, he made a reservation.
I know he did
Like,
all the
he showed
things.
up on
He
time.
he picked
Like,
me up from the city. He put me in a cab. I know. He was good at conversation. He was very thoughtful. He was funny. I know. And this is
asked
yeah, and he
questions.
listened. He was such a great listener. And you think, gosh, we don't, you know, it's sad to say, and this is not, a man bashing exercise at all. But for a lot of women, like our bar is so low that anything slightly above that, we're like, we're mush, and our defenses come down. And when you talk about trust, there are these little things that create that trust that we may not have had before. And these are all bare minimum hygiene things, right? But when we get them, we're like,
Right.
oh my God, he's amazing and he's this and he's this and he's this. And all our girlfriends go, oh, wow, that's incredible because they might not be getting that in their relationships. So we kind of like revere these behaviors that should just be like it should just be normal, but it's not, sadly. So anyway.
As you're thinking about dating in this phase of your life, you're after a divorce, you're now a single mother. I can just imagine that your identity as a mother and now a woman entering this next phase also impacted how you approach dating in this relationship. What was kind of coming up for you when you thought about getting back out there?
Yeah, I was in two minds when I decided to go like to start dating. And when I got married and when I met my ex-husband, dating apps weren't a thing. So this was a whole new world for me that I had to learn. And there was part of me that was like, you know what? I'm just going to have some fun with this. Because the reality is, when you're in your 40s and you're working full time and you're single parenting, you don't go out. Sadly, you don't go out. You go to a bar or you go to a work event, and that's not the place to meet people necessarily. And if you are out, everyone's down on their phones. They're not looking up and around. So I kind of accepted the fact that this was how I was going to meet somebody, or this was how I was going to meet new people in my life. And then when I met Hamish, or Max as he was known on the dating app, I was more intentional about my interactions with him. I think I had reached a point in my life where I thought, you know what? I would like some companionship, somebody who I can get to know, somebody who I can spend time with on the weekends doing the things that I love, not just for a bit of fun, but for something more meaningful and something deeper. As I went into that, I did think about my role as a mother. I was very clear from the beginning that I didn't want to introduce just anyone to my daughter. She didn't need a father figure, she had a dad. So for me, I was really clear on that. And so when I met Max slash Hamish, he didn't meet my daughter for a very long time. And actually, even when he was arrested, he didn't really have a relationship with her. That wasn't really a thing. And that was intentional. And I'm so glad that I did that in retrospect. I was really not in a rush to introduce her to anybody. It was so nice just to have something for me.
Yeah, but I could just really relate to what you were saying about wanting to have something that was for yourself. On that end, I'd be curious, as we now move forward in the story, again, eventually he was revealed to be a con man. Where were some of those early moments where your intuition started to speak up?
Well, Jamila, it didn't. That's actually the problem.
Mm,
It didn't because everything was so fabricated in a way that I had no doubts about him or our relationship. He created this movie that went on for nearly 18 months. There were characters in the movie, there were sets, there were scenes, there was this whole world that he created for me, and he had different movies going on for different victims. Everything lined up. Nothing was amiss. My intuition didn't kick in at all. And I thought and believed that I had a really good intuition. And it wasn't until he was arrested and I saw a Crime Stoppers video on the internet of him being arrested that that's when I realized what had happened. And even then, I was like, oh my God, they've made a mistake. Like, why are they arresting him? This is ridiculous. I had to go and speak to the detectives very soon after I saw that video. I found out his real name. I found out his real age. I found out who he actually was, his history, all of the crimes he had committed. And so I had to kind of recalibrate that backwards for 18 months. So, sadly, my intuition didn't kick in at all. And it's not until years and years afterwards where I've unpicked the story by finding out different pieces of information that I go, oh, yeah, okay, maybe. Yeah, I did think that was a bit weird, but I didn't question it because I wasn't suspicious of him. And when we trust people and we don't suspect them of betraying us to that level or any level at all, you don't you don't question. When he told me his parents died in a plane crash and left him an orphan at 6 years old, there was not one part of me that wanted to say, can you give me the evidence? Show me the report. Prove it. Prove that to me, as if a human would ever say that. The only things I felt were compassion and empathy. I've lost a parent, when I was relatively young. He weaponized that because most humans will never ask for the evidence. They will never verify the information that's coming at them. And these are the psychological tactics that these types of people play on. But it's not human nature to do that. So I didn't suspect, my intuition didn't kick in, and I had to see a law enforcement video of him being arrested to know and believe what had happened.
Wow. There are so many layers to that. This idea of him creating a movie for you to be a main character in, and you not knowing you were playing a role. Also, this idea of what does curiosity and inquiry mean in relationships? Because we do kind of feel that if we ask more questions when someone tells us a story, that's actually an act of disconnection, that's an act of questioning somebody instead of coming from a place of curiosity. And so I find that even in myself, like I won't ask the next question. I think even as I've started to do this podcast, it's now a muscle to get into to like
Yeah.
ask the next question.
Yeah.
Right. But
Yeah.
that's not something you're doing when you're talking to someone, building a relationship with them, and just trying to get to know them.
Mm.
It's a really different muscle.
It is. And
Yeah.
I guess there's this whole thing like asking another question, which is inquiry and curiosity and coming from a really curious place, I guess. I love asking questions. I love finding out about people. But then there's this line where it comes from a place of suspicion or mm, I wouldn't say distrust entirely, but sadly, we should be doing that. And if the person is legitimate, sitting across the table from you, they will not mind. If someone is a genuine human, they will not mind you doing that. I think there's a line, there's a way in which you can do it. And verification, to verify information coming at us and thinking about it critically is really important. When these betrayals and these misconducts are happening and we are being manipulated in this way, the intention of the criminal or the manipulator is to change your brain psychology. It is to try and put your brain into a heightened emotional state so you actually abort your critical thinking. And these
Mm.
heightened states are things like fear, hope, excitement, love. And I think, apart from fear, he didn't play on fear, but I was hopeful for the future. I was excited about what we were doing and I was in love. And it's these things that in our brain, we bypass some of the other critical thinking that we would ordinarily do if we weren't in that heightened emotional state. So that's why our friends and family can often see the things that we can't when we're in love with someone. Because when you're wearing your rose colored glasses, all the red flags are just flags. And, I think that's a really important thing to notice as well, that these things are weaponized and it creates us not to think critically about the information coming at us. So even just understanding that is a step forward, I think.
Completely. And I definitely want us to get into kind of how your friends and family were a part of this story as well, which I know will be an important aspect for us to get into. But perhaps this is a good moment for us to play our little game here in the middle of our show. And you mentioned like him creating these scenes in movies. So I definitely want to get your thoughts on some of the romantic reality shows that are out there right now.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Well, this is Would You Rather. Would you rather be on Marriage at First Sight or Love is Blind?
I think Married at First Sight. Yeah.
Oh,
Mm.
okay. Tell us more. I thought you were going to go the other way.
No, no, I think I like Married at First Sight in the sense that you are there, you are in the relationship, you are living with someone. You can't hide. You can't hide in that regard. What I also like about Married at First Sight is they do, super speed the relationship with the challenges and it's there to create drama, of course. But I also like that there's agency whether to stay in the relationship or not. And yes, if, the 2 people have to agree, but, and then throughout that process, you're also getting expert guidance. So you have the ability to bring up these issues and work through them and decide whether you wanna stay in that relationship or not. Um, yeah, I think look, I wouldn't go on either of them, even if you paid me $1,000,000,
Right.
but just in answer to this question, I think they're the reasons I'd do that one.
I love it. Yeah, I was thinking about this idea of at first sight and what does vetting look like. And in Love is Blind, you kind of in the pods, you're supposed to be asking these questions. But I hear you, even if they're answering the questions in the pods, it's not the same as literally living with them and being tested
Mm,
in a real relationship context.
yeah.
So actually, yeah, I may switch my vote too.
And I think when we're trying to discern about people, there are many, many cues that we get, both behavioral, psychological, and so if you're only hearing answer, I mean, people can tell you whatever they want, right?
Especially if you can't read the body
That's
language,
it.
like, they're in the pod, you're not seeing
Yeah,
them.
if you can look someone in the eye, if you can see how their body's reaction, like we are animals, really. And we have these instincts. Quite often we ignore them, but we do have these instincts. Now, people can also manipulate their body language and things like and master manipulators like Hamish McLaren are very, very good at it. So I may not have even seen that, but verification is multi-layered. So you've got the stories and the words, you've got the voice, you've got the eye contact, the body language, the physical interaction, and then you get to see how they play out these challenges or life together in a very confined, intense environment. And all of those cues, are your verification points. It's easy to give a really good answer to a question. It's not so easy to live with someone for 3 months and keep that facade up. Time tells, it really does.
Exactly. Everything you said definitely has me thinking about this differently, but I'd be curious for your answer to this one. Would you rather trust someone instantly and risk being wrong or question everything and risk pushing people away?
This is a hard one, but I am an eternal optimist, even with everything that has happened. And I would say the first answer because I do in my heart believe that most people are good people. Most people want the best for others. Most people do the right thing. There are some bad actors and some nefarious characters that we come across that ruin it for everyone else. When this all happened to me, I made a really clear decision a few years afterwards, a few years after he was arrested. And I thought to myself, I don't want to let this experience poisoned me in a way that I became super cynical. I'm not going to lie, I look at the world differently now. I had never come across somebody like Hamish in my life. I'd never experienced such evil. But at the end of the day, I'm optimistic at heart. I do believe in the goodness of people. I believe in the collective goodness of people. And so I would rather have that point of view and not let this poison me and go through life like that than the other way. What I would say is though I am much more critical in my thinking now. I don't distrust immediately, but I definitely think about the information that's coming at me in a much, much, much more critical way. I think the world is a good place. And for me, if that experience changed me to the point where I felt poisoned and cynical, then That meant that he won. And in that moment, I thought, you know what? He doesn't deserve to win. He deserves to be in jail. He deserves to do the time. He deserves to have the spotlight of shame on him. I deserve a good life. I deserve to be happy. I deserve to think beautifully about the world. And I always have. So there was just this real moment in time where I made that decision. But I am a much more critical thinker than I've ever been.
It's wonderful that you ended this experience with that perspective. I think it would be completely understandable if cynicism or just generally kind of having a higher guard up was the reaction, but I think it's great that you kind of saw this as a moment of empowerment and being able to still maintain your trust in people.
It took some time. It did take some time to get there. This wasn't something that I woke up the day after he was arrested and felt like, you know, this was a very long journey and process that I had to go through. Mm.
Yeah. Well, you've alluded to this moment of seeing him on television, he's arrested. When you finally started to understand what had happened, what was the hardest part to admit to yourself or to others?
Just that it was real, like it felt so surreal because I was in love with this man. You know, Minutes before saw him being arrested, I was calling Bondi police and asking them to do a wellness check on him because I hadn't heard from him in 24 hours. That's how concerned I was for his welfare. In minutes, I had to go from being in love with a man to kind of understanding that he was a criminal. It took sort of a bit of time to fall out of love with him, if that makes sense. And I hated the fact that I was grieving a criminal. Like, it was just so complex and so multi-layered and so discombobulating in my mind. There were just so many different stages of what I was thinking and what I was learning and what I was seeing and what I had to piece together as I was realizing what was unfolding. The self-talk was horrible. One thing I sometimes say in my talks is that it almost wouldn't matter what somebody said to me about this experience because what I've said to myself is far worse. Literally nothing
Oh,
anybody could say to me about what happened to me in the worst possible way, and sometimes the comments, Jamila, are pretty brutal, you know, pretty brutal online, but there is nothing that could be said that I haven't already said to myself, and that's
mm,
strangely quite a powerful place to be in when you decide to speak publicly about something like this because, there are gonna be people that have opinions about what has happened to you and the decisions you made and the mistakes you made, but, I think that was sort of for me, I had already given myself a hard enough time. And I think one of the hardest things of this whole experience and speaking publicly has actually assisted in this process is that giving myself a level of self compassion in the same way that I would to a friend who had been through something like this was was really really difficult, and it has taken time to get to a place where I've had to forgive myself and really be compassionate about the decisions that I made, the position I found myself in, and what actually transpired. As humans, we're not great at it. As women, we're even more poor in doing it. Like we are so tough on ourselves. We expect so much of ourselves. And sometimes in life, these things happen through no fault of your own, or even through decisions you've made. But that's just life. Like, you're never going to go through life perfectly, and that took a long time for me to get to be honest.
I can just imagine everyone listening relating to this idea of complicated grief. People or situations or jobs that weren't perfect, that actually we learned were harmful but were meaningful to us. As you think about that journey that you went on, forgiving yourself, processing the grief, understanding that he wasn't the man that you thought he was, what were some of those stages that you went through or tools that really helped you be able to move forward?
Getting information was critical to me. I'm a very rational, pragmatic, um, analytical in a lot of ways person. What was difficult at the time was because it was a criminal case that lasted 3 years. There was very little information coming at me. I had so many questions. And the thing about human brains is we don't like unfinished stories. We don't like jigsaw puzzles that have missing pieces, because our brains can't actually rest unless we have the pieces of the story that help it make sense in our brains so we can put it aside and move on. So I couldn't rest because there were so many unanswered questions, because there were so many lies, and then there were 15 other victims in this case. And but unfortunately, because it was a criminal case being handled by the police and the detectives, they were very restricted in what they could tell me. And then because it was a criminal case, the financial institutions were very restrictive in what they could tell me. There was sort of like what I describe as like it was an information vortex. And that's very, very difficult to reconcile within yourself and to move on and to heal if you don't have the answers to things. There was a very famous podcast that was done by the Australian newspaper. An investigative journalist looked into this story, and the podcast was called Who the Hell is Hamish? And through his investigations, he sort of unpicked Hamish's crimes and life over the last 30 years. He found people in almost every continent of the world who were victims of Hamish McLaren. And he and I became very close. So every time he got a piece of information, he reached out to me, he gave it to me. And for me, that was so incredibly healing because, I didn't even know his real name. I didn't know what was true and what wasn't. And I wasn't going to get those answers from Hamish, although he was calling me from jail. He was sending me letters from jail, but he had another kind of purpose of doing that. In terms of those stages of recovery, the first thing was getting information, because there was nothing for me to hang on to. I just had 18 months of memories with this beautiful man who I thought I was going to spend the rest of my life with. And so that was really healing. And then, of course I've had so much therapy. I have tried every different type of therapeutic remedy there is. Um, I've really invested in that because I had to get my head around this thing. And then to be able to speak about it publicly, I had to be in a strong enough position to do that. Over time, I told people in the very beginning, very, very few people knew. Even after the podcast was released and when I released my book in 2024, there were still people in 2024 who I worked with at the time who were like, well, this is a plot twist, Trace. We had no idea. Over time, it's just been increments of things that have happened. I wouldn't say it's any one big thing. And just as I've felt strong enough, or something's come my way that's helped me in that recovery and that journey to putting myself back together, because I didn't only have to put my financial future back together, I had to put my soul back together. And that's been a harder, longer journey than rebuilding finances, to be fair.
Yeah, there are many, many elements of what you just shared. I guess for one, this idea that he was still trying to contact you, even after everything that was happening. How did it feel when his calls were coming in, messages? Did you block immediately, or was there a part of you that actually really wanted to hear from him and his explanations?
I was so desperate for information. So when he first started calling me, you don't know, I didn't know it was him. It was a blocked number, and you get a little thing at the beginning that says you've got 6 minutes. You're about to talk to someone from a correctional facility. Stay on the line if you want to chat. Don't if you don't. And I was so desperate for information at this point. So I was just peppering him with all the questions that were unanswered. He was very aloof, I was saying, "What's your name? What's your identity? Like, who are you? Like, what is this all about? Like, explain this to me." And he would just kind of say things like, "It's just a name, T. Don't get hung up on a name. It's just a name." And I think, "What do you mean? Like, this is your identity for the past 18 months. Like, you have deceived me in the most incredible way. And you're telling me not to worry about your name? Like, at least tell me who you are. Like, are your parents alive? Were you married? Do you have children? What was your job?" Like, because at this stage I didn't know anything. And I realized pretty quickly with the phone calls that I wasn't going to get anything that I needed or wanted. And he was never going to tell me the truth. He was just, I think it just probably wanted to brighten his day to talk to me. And you only get 6 minutes. Now, 6 minutes goes really, really quickly. And so, what's he gonna, what kind of conversation are we gonna have in that time? And at this point, I'm just so confused with everything that's happening. So, I took some calls, but a few months after, I just went, you know what, I'm not taking any more calls. And, like he called me on Father's Day and, wanted to see if I was okay because my dad had passed away and he knew that would be a hard day for
Right.
me. And it was just like, you are still weaponizing your skills against me. Like it was just unfathomable, to be honest. It's just gross, really. It's gross, dirty
Right.
behavior. And then the letters were more about him trying to get me to go and see him. When you send a letter from jail or when you make a phone call from jail, they are able to be looked at. And he was trying to say to me that there are certain things that I can't say in a letter or over the phone. And if you come and see me, we can have that chat. I thought about it. I thought about it for more than a hot minute. I really did because I thought, you know what? Anything to get that money back. I lost $317,000. My life savings, I would have done anything in those minutes and moments to get that money back. And I considered it. I never went and saw him. I never went and visited him because essentially I felt like he was, dangling a $317,000 carrot in front of my face for what end game? Suddenly, had he had an epiphany and he was going to tell me the truth? No. Like, I think the guy was delusional. The final thing he did, which was kind of scary, he had a bunch of flowers sent to my work one day. And the biggest bunch of flowers I'd ever seen, Australian natives. And it arrives and I get it and I think, oh, it's one of my girlfriends sending me a care package or something. And I open the card and it says, "See you soon. Love, Hamish." And this is the truth. I threw up. I went to the office toilets and
Mm.
I threw up. I felt so sick because I thought, oh my god, he's got out of jail and the detectives haven't told me, and he's waiting downstairs for me. I don't know what this is about. And I was just a wreck. I was such a mess, and I ended up calling law enforcement and telling them that I'd been receiving all these communications, and they put a stop to it.
It's incredibly destabilizing and
Yeah,
frightening.
it was.
And that reminder that he knew your life so intimately. I'm glad that law enforcement was able to support you in that moment. I was wondering what lie amongst all of them felt the most shocking and hardest for you to understand or move on from. I mean, you mentioned identity and literally his name, but there was so many layers to the lies.
It was the lie of our relationship. This was a lie that was constructed over a 16-month period. It was every handhold. It was every glance. It was every text message. It was every offer of help. It was every time he listened, the plans we had for our future. It was our shared values and interests. It was the fact that we could go surfing together. It was the fact that he presented himself as a reflection of what I had explained that I wanted in my life moving forward. The hardest lie about that was all fake. Like it was false, it was falsified, it was manufactured because he knew that if he just became the person that I said that I wanted in my life, then I would naturally trust and fall in love with him. And then that is exactly what happened. How do you fake loving someone for that long and that consistently and that authentically when underneath you are literally plotting to destroy them? That is the bit that I can't get my head around because that would never even enter my mind to do something. Most times if you're with someone and they're not really that into you, you kind of know, right? You know. With
Right.
with him, it just felt so real, and yet it was so manufactured. And I think that is the lie that, yes, the
Wow.
money's one thing. Like that sucks. It's so hard. Life has been really bloody hard for the last 9 years. But it's that emotional manufacturing of love. That's the bit that I can't get my head around.
So difficult. You also, of course, had to rebuild a sense of safety amongst your community. There was this moment where you were kind of slow to reveal what had happened to various groups of people in your life. How did your relationships change? And what was the reaction amongst people who were close to you? I'm sure they might have been invested in too.
Yeah, I mean, some of them had met him. Isolation is another kind of tactic that they use. So, but yeah, look, my friends, my closest friends and family, they all knew. But for the majority of people, nobody knew. Chose to keep it a secret. Part goodness to that. When I was at work and I was running a big team and I had multi-million dollar budgets and I was doing all the things and I was a marketing executive, I wasn't the woman who just lost her life savings to a guy who pretended to love her. It was a really good way of compartmentalizing my life, to be honest. It was so overwhelming. There were parts of me that actually appreciated the fact that I could put it aside and be the executive at work and do what I needed to do. Again, when I was at home and I was being mum, I didn't have time to sit there and, grieve about all these things. I had to get on with it. And that was a really good, motivation for me as well. So I think my job and my daughter at those moments were really foundational in me just kind of continuing on. Otherwise, to be honest, I would have laid in bed all day under my doona crying. I had to save those moments for the dark hours of night when I was on my own. But what I realized
Mm,
post this and post talking about it more broadly is the shame I felt created and the secrecy around the situation created distance between people that knew me or that I was close with that didn't know such a huge part of my life. And it wasn't like I was lying, I was just ashamed. Shame is an emotion that creates a lot of loneliness because you're distant from others because you are worried about what they're going to say, think, and feel about you if you reveal this thing about yourself. Even greater than that, shame makes you lonely from yourself because I didn't even want to admit what had happened. Like it has been an unraveling and an unpicking of every point in this, journey since over the past 9 years. So it's kind of I find it fascinating, but at the time, I didn't really understand fully in the way that I do now. But, the moment I decided to speak about this publicly and go on the podcast and speak to the media, that was the moment that all of those things kind of came together and that power within me sort of fueled that. Even though it was an unpopular decision, my friends and family said, "Don't do it, Trace. It'll ruin your career. You're not strong enough. This is going to take you backwards." That was the advice I was given. And I just felt so strongly within myself that I was in a position to do that when the time came.
wow. It's a huge aspect of why I started this platform is recognizing how the toughest moments, the hardest decisions we make in life are often the moments where we are hiding the most, where we're the most unsure. And actually, healing can come from being in community and being able to be seen and share these experiences in the messy middle instead of at the end, right? So it's incredibly brave that you, in the end, did decide to be public and share your story to help others. I was also curious about the dissonance you might have been feeling between being this boss at work who would never be the victim of a romance fraud and knowing in your private life that that was happening. When you decided to go public, was that a moment where you were saying, this dissonance is just between these two identities just doesn't work anymore. I have I have to speak out. What
Yeah.
was kind of that driving force?
It is exactly that. The pull and the drive and the fire to speak about this in the hope that it would help others or that it would help this issue that is impacting everyone globally right now was greater than the fear I had around it ruining my reputation, impacting my career, having to relive some of the trauma. The desire to make something purposeful out of the pain that I felt was greater than my fear of all of those other things. But it took a few years to get there. Wasn't always like that.
Of course, time is the biggest aspect of how we're able to move ahead. You mentioned how this is now just such a global issue, and I did want to, have a moment to help contextualize for people why this was so important for you to speak about. I think everyone may be familiar with Tinder Swindler, the documentary on Netflix, and it's something that is a bit more sensationalized, I guess, in recent eras. But I think you had shared some statistics of, I think it's 21 billion. You may have shared $21 billion Americans, so in the US, lost to scams and fraud in 2025. I just want to hear from you what you've learned about this whole issue since you've gone on this journey and since you've gone public.
Yeah, 100%. And you're right. These are the statistics that we get from, our government bodies and things like this. So I'm actually in the US at the moment, speaking at a fraud conference. And I've just spent the last
Mm,
2 days with 500 people who work in this industry fighting fraud every day. And the statistics are so underreported. So, whilst $21 billion in America has been reported to be lost to scams and fraud last year, that is just the tip of the iceberg. And the reason for that is because a huge proportion of people who lose money to scams and fraud will never report it. And there's a whole range of reasons why people don't report. Some people think nothing can be done. Some people don't want to relive the trauma. There's career risk, reputational damage, and of course, there's shame. The biggest one is shame. People are embarrassed to report it. But how can you solve a problem if you don't have the full picture? What I like to do is to use my story to bridge that gap between organizations and consumers or humans and use the story to help people realize that there is no shame in reporting or speaking about these issues because it is more common than you think, and the shame belongs to the criminal. The shame belongs to the person who has committed the crime, not you. And what I like to say to victims all the time is so many people come to me after I do my talks or whatever and say, I've never told anybody this. Or not even my parents
mm,
know, but I've lost significant amounts of money to this. I hear so many stories. And I'm not advocating for everyone to speak publicly the way that I do. I'm just advocating for people to understand that they are a victim of crime. They have been targeted. The shame belongs to the criminal, and it is not your fault. Even just some in those conversations help people move that little bit further forward. Yeah, speaking at this conference this week in Charlotte, some of the statistics, the real statistics, are absolutely frightening. It is the biggest transfer of wealth that we have ever seen in history. And this is not random people down the street targeting you, it's transnational organized crime. Some people listening now may have heard about the scam compounds that are set up in places like Southeast Asia. And the people working in these compounds have been lured there by fake employment opportunities to better their own lives. And once they get to these locations, they have their passports stolen from them. They are imprisoned and they are tortured if they don't meet their scam KPIs. So they are very aggressive on the phone trying to get these scams to work on us. In these compounds, because it is organized crime, it's very organized, they have systems, they have resources, they have data, they have playbooks, they work off scripts, and they have access to AI technology that is said to be 2 years ahead of anything we've seen. So they are operating at a scale that is so sophisticated that most of us have no idea what's coming at us. And that's something I like to educate on too, because sure, it's not just the shame that we're carrying as victims, but if you don't understand the threat landscape, if you don't understand how these things work, how can you ever start to protect yourself? So, these kind of conversations that I'm having are opening people's eyes to the world that we're living in and why every single day, almost it feels that we will get a text message, an email, something through our digital devices that is fraudulent, that is there to manipulate and trick us into sending money to criminals. And that is where the $21 billion is going, plus, plus, plus. $21 billion is going. If there is anything that I hate more, is that the money that we have worked so hard for just gets to go to a criminal. Yeah, I can't stand it. And so yeah, this is I've turned my experience of what happened to me into trying to kind of have a voice and have a human voice in this space that's not a bank, that's not a a fintech or financial sort of institution or something talking about this, because we have to understand this from a human perspective. And we have to do everything we can to protect ourselves. Education is still one of the biggest kind of levers we have to pull, because these criminals are working so quickly and so fast. They are so far ahead of us. We are not organized. We are very slow moving when it comes to government and banks in every country of the world. And so education and awareness is key, because the weakest link in this whole thing is humans. It's us. Because
Mhm.
because we do think the best of people. We do trust blindly. We do act on authority. If you get a message from the FBI to say, you're in trouble or you need to do these things, most people will do them. We're very law abiding citizens for the most part. And so they play on this. This is called authority bias. So they're tricking our brains to go do the thing so that they can get the money. This part of the education piece as well. Anyway, that was a bit of a rant. Sorry. Just put this.
I love it. And again, you're educating people. That's what you do now, and it is so important. One, the human devastation behind the scenes of this, the fact that there is human trafficking happening, where people are being completely exploited to do these scams all over the world, but also the exploitation of the victim of the fraud as well. I think you mentioned though this idea that a lot of people don't report it because they think nothing can be done. And I am wondering, as you face the reality of having lost your life savings, what has that financial rebuild or implications look like? Was anything recovered through the legal system? Yeah, I know that that is something that people may not have that much education about.
Yeah. So sadly, no, none of the money that was taken by Hamish was recovered from any of the victims. So he
Wow.
was prosecuted for swindling 15 Australian victims out of $7.6 million. None of that money has been recovered. Through the investigation with the podcast, that was estimated to be somewhere between 60 to $100 million, just based on the people that the journalist spoke to. Now, of course, they're in
Wow.
other jurisdictions, so that's difficult to prosecute. None of the money was recovered. And if we talk about more broadly with, these transnational digital crimes and scams that are happening, which most people that lose money to scams and fraud will never go through what I went through. Mine was a very intimate, personal, one-to-one relationship. A lot of these digital scams coming our way, where people are losing money, is because it is transnational. It is past the jurisdiction of the borders that our law enforcement have control over. It is very, very difficult to get that money back. It is very, very, very difficult. On top of that, fraud generally is very, very difficult to prosecute, because on paper, it looks like I have voluntarily given that money or clicked that link or given a passcode to a system. What the law doesn't take into account is that you have been manipulated and deceived and socially engineered to do that. That's the bit that's missing. But on paper, some people who lose money to scams and fraud, they'll go to the police and they'll say, this is a civil case. Especially these one-to-ones, you need to go get a lawyer and prosecute civilly because you gave that money to that person. Now, if you've just lost your life savings, you don't have money to pay a lawyer. It is difficult. And then these digital crimes is just another layer of complexity because of this, your jurisdiction and what your law enforcement is able to control. And what is, happening, and I'm not certainly not an expert on this particular, issue, but what they are trying to do is get collaboration with global law enforcement bodies to work out how they can start to coordinate and collaborate and get organized so that we can recover some of those monies. A lot of these crimes, you are asked to pay in crypto. So that is a huge red flag. And once the crypto is gone, it's pretty difficult. There are some traceabilities, but very, very difficult to retrieve. And it moves so fast. If you have lost money, please report. But sadly, the chances of getting that money back are quite slim. I heard at the conference here, if you can get a report in the first 72 hours in America, you have more chance. So time is of the essence. So that was an interesting thing I heard this week. Again, this is why education and awareness is so important, especially with our more vulnerable communities. So our parents, our seniors, and then of course on the other end of the spectrum, our children. With teenage
Wow.
financial sexual extortion, so yeah,
Mm.
there's some real challenges, which again is why I say education awareness is key.
Wow. Well, it almost feels like that victimization twice in a way, kind of not being able to have a direct remedy for what you have lost. And I think another thing you touched on is this idea of, consent. Like in the case of a fraud, you consented to give your money to this person, but consent under manipulation, it's not full consent because you didn't have full information. But our legal framework just sees consent as like black and white. That's really, really tough in the current environment to talk about. And I think that's what adds to the shame. It's like I chose
Yeah,
this,
I did it. It was
but
my fault.
without thinking about the
Yeah,
context.
yeah.
Right. Of no, you were manipulated, you're and as you say, a victim of a crime. So I think that applies to so many different types of situation beyond just fraud, but this kind of black and white approach to, well, you chose this is not serving. It's not serving us.
100%. And
Yeah.
hopefully it will change over time. Hopefully there is some changes, that will occur off the back of this. The challenge is it's slow. We need these changes now. We need to understand this now. We need to, the digital nature of these things and how it works. Like, our laws haven't even caught up with that yet, So
Right.
it's challenging. It's challenging. But I think the more we speak about it, the more we raise these issues, the more we advocate for these changes, then I do have hope that things will happen. It's just the question of when.
Yeah. Well, as we wrap here, I'd be curious for perhaps the one thing you might want to say to someone listening who is feeling regret about potentially having been a victim of manipulation or fraud in a relationship in particular. As you said, romance fraud is so uniquely fraught. I think you have had that experience that could really help someone maybe see their situation a little differently.
I would say that it is not your fault. You have been targeted. These people are professionals at what they do. They use social engineering and tactics to manipulate and deceive you, and they're very, very good at it. If at all possible, find a way to provide yourself with a huge amount of self compassion. And part of this whole process, too, is just accepting what has happened. You can't change it. I can't change what happened to me. What I can do is find some agency within myself to work out what I do next. And, what I do next is give myself some self compassion. What I do next is understand that I am a victim of crime. And what I do next is find a way to use my experience to help other people. And if that is just having one conversation, if that is just revealing to the person you love in your family or a friend what has happened to you to release the burden from yourself, if that is sending me an email and telling me your story, that is okay as well. And I get a lot of those, and I'm very much here for it. If that's needed, then please reach out to me. But yeah, first and foremost, huge amount of self compassion, and then figure out the strength inside yourself to move forward. You'll never, they have this concept of resilience about bouncing back. And, people used to say to me, oh, now the criminal trial's over, you can just get over it and move on. And it used to bug me so much because probably like other people who have been through this, I will never move on from this. I will,
Mm,
like, this is a part of me now. It's not who I am, but it's certainly a part of me. And I will move forward, yes, and I will rebuild and I will recover. But I'm not just gonna get over it, and that is the most insulting thing you can say to somebody who has been through this. It is part of you. For me, it has I don't regret the situation because I feel like it's actually made me a better person. I'm far wiser. I'm more critical in my thinking. I'm more compassionate and I'm stronger than I ever thought I could possibly be. So they're all benefits, right? But, this is a part of me now and I move forward with it inside me. And that's just the truth. And I think that's what I've come to accept and then figure out what I do with that next. So that's the journey I've been on. I don't know if
Right.
that helps, but yeah, please, if you are in that position, please reach out to me. I have no problem receiving an email from people who have been in my situation.
I know it will help people for sure. So thank you so much for that. And our final question on the show, because we're all about building the courage to live your truth, what would you like to say to the haters? The people who judged you for being a victim of romance fraud, who felt like this is the most ridiculous thing that could happen and would never happen to them. What would you say to those folks?
My mom has this really great saying, and it's kind of old fashioned, but it works well in this context. There, but for the grace of God, go I. For those people who have that opinion, I feel like saying, good for you that you've never experienced this and you have no concept of my reality. And therefore, you have that opinion. I am happy for you because I wouldn't wish this on my worst enemy. I do see a lot of comments. Sometimes I really try not to look at them because they're quite brutal. But sometimes I do look at them and I think, I don't see them as haters. I see them as people who just don't have the capacity to understand what I've been through in my personal experience. And how lucky is that for them? you know and so I just have a level of compassion. I think, I don't give them too much time, to be honest, because the majority of people that come my way and speak to me, they're the conversations I have. And again, because I am an eternal optimist, I just focus on those conversations knowing that what I'm doing is having a positive impact. And so I just keep going.
Yeah. Well, amazing saying, from your mom. And I think it's all too true. Well, thank you so much for being on the show, Tracy. Your story is incredibly powerful. And as you said, we hope no one has to experience what you've gone through. But I think through the education and the words that you shared, we'll be better equipped going forward. For our listeners, you can find Tracy at tracyhall.com.au. Please check out her book. It's called The Last Victim. It has even more about the incredible story of resilience and healing that she has gone through as well. But is there anything else you want to share with our listeners, Tracy?
No, I'm so grateful for this conversation that is not just about what happened, but the impact that I had and what I've learned from it. So, yeah, the emotional depth of this conversation has been very refreshing. So, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful I could share it with you and your listeners today.
If today's conversation sparks something for you, don't ignore it. You're not doing life wrong. You're doing life courageously. Be sure to subscribe to Unpopular Decisions wherever you get your podcasts. And if this episode resonated, we would love for you to share it with a friend or write us a review because we're on a mission to inspire 1 million brave life choices. And courage multiplies when it's witnessed. Thank you so much for listening. I'm glad you're here.